Welcome to today's episode of Hack Your hazcom. It is my pleasure to introduce my guest, Manuela Dukeshire, who has spent the past 16 years working in hazard communication and global STS authoring. And since 2009, she has supported customers worldwide through her role at DR Software, providing software demonstrations, training, and technical assistance to help companies manage the complex requirements of hazard classification and regulatory compliance. She is an active member of the hazard communication community, currently serving as co-chair of the Alliance Committee and chair of the OSHA Fact Sheet Subcommittee for the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication. She also serves on the Professional Development Committee and has been a long-time member of both the SCHC and the sister society of the UK, the Chemical Hazard Communication Society. She holds a bachelor's, master's, and MBA, which together support her technical expertise, problem-solving skills, and global perspective. In addition, she is fluent in English and German, has some proficiency in Spanish and French, and can read Latin and Ancient Greek, making her work with multilingual SDS authoring and international compliance even more effective. Welcome, Manuela. How are you today?
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Well, I wanted you over today to discuss some common pain points in our profession that we find. So in your over 16 years in the field, what do you think has changed the most about how companies approach hazard communication?
So what has developed is the legislation has become stricter, and that we suddenly have more of it. So what is developing are a lot of notification requirements, registration requirements in different countries and areas in the world. In the past, what I've seen is that English SDSs were accepted in other countries, whereas now the focus really is becoming on having an SDS in the official language of that country. So we're looking at a lot more details in hazard communication than I find it was at the beginning.
Okay. What do you find is rewarding and challenging in this field?
I think it's a very exciting field because it is changing a lot. So one of the things I wanted to touch on anyway is for people to be involved in the societies, SCHC, CHCS, any other society, receive newsletters, stay up to date on the industry because exciting things are always happening, new things are always happening. And while some people might think hazcom can come across as dry, if you look at it from a perspective of really what it's doing in the world, the effect it is having on workplaces and employees and safety, then it does become a very exciting field. And even when you're reading legislation, when you look at different legislation from different countries and you find the comparisons, sometimes you feel like you might be solving a puzzle or just figuring out really how you're going to put this together. And that can be a lot of fun.
Great. And I think you touched a little bit on this as far as your customers. What do you see them facing as far as their challenges? And how might someone new to our profession untangle the requirements?
Okay, so I think that a lot of people, when you look at hazcom, it becomes really overwhelming because it affects so many industries, so many fields, so many countries. So what you want to do is stay simple and logical and create a step-by-step approach. So look at it from a marketing perspective. If you're going into a new market, you need to understand that market. And you're going to do the same thing when you're going and hazard communication into a new market. What happens, you will start out, for example, in the US, and we're comfortable with this market, and then suddenly you have to expand into another country. Now you have to keep that separate from your US market because the other market is going to be very different. And you have to start at an umbrella approach. So you look at the area and countries. So if we're looking at the EU, you need to look at the EU regulations. But then some countries have specific regulations as well. If we're looking at Canada, for example, there can be specific requirements for individual provinces. So you do have to break it down to all the levels and really understand what your market is. And then you also have to look at where it's being manufactured, transportation, and to whom it is being sold. So there are steps. So as long as you keep the steps separate and clear, it's easier to approach all of it, instead of looking at it from an overwhelming large amount of information.
Okay. And the common mistakes I'm sure you're finding out there, what can you say about those?
Common mistakes. So mistakes are people are not keeping up with the legislative changes. So, or maybe with the legislation itself, but the discussion points that are behind them. So you need to understand it deeper than the legislation actually says. There's situations, for example, with microplastics and nanoforms in the EU, or a situation in the US with carcinogenic classifications and environmental hazards on your SDS. So there's information that's written on the SDS and in the legislation that is supposed to be on the SDS, but then you have to look at the letters of interpretation from OSHA, for example, on guidance documents. OSHA has a guidance document for auditors. Now, that is not yet updated to the new legislation, but it's a document that shows you what auditors use, what auditors are looking for. And that, for example, really clarifies the carcinogenic issue that is often in discussion and approached in incorrect ways in the US. So the pain point is that you really need to look beyond the legislative text, but the legislation is always the final say. So we've seen errors in guidance documents, things that don't always perfectly align with the legislation. So you do have to stick to the legislation as the final say.
Sure. Okay. And then you touched earlier upon the fact that I'm working in one market. Let's say, 99% of what I do is in the US, and suddenly management changes, companies change, role has changed. And now I'm suddenly given responsibility for the EU or Asia. What do I do, and what are some good steps to take to know that what I'm seeing online or when I'm researching legislation is correct? And nowadays with AI, being what it is, even the Google search has changed, where you're getting a Google summary, and you may want to go straight to that and think that's 100% of what I should be believing in. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there are various things in your question here. So the first thing I always recommend is you go directly to the government of the country to which you're going. Okay, so that is easy if you're going to the ECHO website, because that is going to be in English and you can read the legislation in English. That's nice and straightforward for you. But if you are going to Korea and you don't speak Korean, it is still important to look at the original legislation. It is important to get the substance lists from the actual government websites and not from summaries somewhere else. So that is where errors can occur. And yes, if you cannot understand the language, there are many resources you can use. Now, some of these countries do have translations into English, but you can also use AI or just translation softwares to simply translate parts of it. Now, what that does, it's not a perfect translation. We always have to be careful with it, so it cannot be used in a legal defense. But it is something that helps you understand the legislation rather than reading someone else's summary, because summaries then become not someone else's summaries and someone else's summaries, and that's how you go into the area of urban legends in hazcom. Then the other thing, and I mentioned the AI already, so if you're going to be using AI, if you're looking at information, AI can be useful because it can provide you with links to the resources that you're looking for. So you might ask AI what you can do when you're going into this new market and what is needed. So it'll give you a summary. You can't rely 100% on the information, but then you ask, can you give me the resources? Can you give me the websites that I need to get this information? Where do I find guidance documents? Where do I find the legislation? And so on. So you can use it as a stepping stone instead of having to start your research blindly it does provide a structure like that for you.
Okay. So really just make sure where you're going to is a proper resource. uh, Do what you can to translate and perhaps even get a subject matter expert if you are not still aware of how good that source is.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. What about, I know we have in what we do, we have to trust and verify data quality and ultimately use that to make our hazard classifications. What do you find as a pain point in that step?
That whole concept is a very big pain point because you might receive an SDS from a supplier for a raw material and then from another supplier, and the classification differs. So what are you going to do then? So let's say we're on the US market and there are no official classifications for raw materials. So then it becomes very complicated at first. But what we have to do is look at it from a holistic approach. So the first thing I would do in those situations is make sure that I can rely on my supplier SDS. That's the first thing. You're allowed to use a classification from a supplier as long as you can rely on it. Now, if you're looking at an SDS, you're not sure if you can rely on the GHS classification, what you can do is look at other parts. Are the other parts aligning with Section 2? Does my substance listing information look okay? What about my tox values? So that is where you can realize if this is a reliable document or not. So that is where you start. You can ask your supplier for more information, and sometimes they don't like to give it, but that's where you can offer an NDA, for example. Or just a little trick is you ask for an EU SDS because they're in Section 3. So this is for preparations. There in Section 3, you would have the classification of the raw materials. So various things can occur there. But then the next step I always suggest is that you look at official classifications worldwide. Now, the grandfather in official classifications is the EU, or grandmother in official classifications is the EU. Because they've had them for the longest times, they're very well researched data. So what you're looking at there is you can justify using a classification like that, even if you're looking at a US SDS, because you have a base and a good data source. So you can also look at different countries because different countries have different substances classified in official classifications. Be careful, of course. The Japanese classifications are extremely strict, and they're not actually mandatory. So that is one of the ones I always warn people about. Maybe you want to be a little cautious using that one. But of course, if you want to use it, if you can use the data, that's great. Another source that is really helpful is the ECHA website, the ECHA dossiers. They can provide a lot of information. But the caveat there is that a lot of people think that these are official classifications, and they are not. In the EU, you have official classifications, and you have the ECHA database. So they have to be approached differently. Even get a disclaimer. We don't read disclaimers and pop-ups as much as we should. But when you use the ECHA database, you will see the disclaimer, and it does say that the data is not checked for veracity. So you must use it with a grain of salt, I would say. So you can look at the dossiers in a new database. It's really easy to get deeper into the dossiers. You can look at the classifications. If only 5 people used one classification in their dossiers and 600 another, then wouldn't go with the one that only is used by 5 companies. So you can use that as well. And then when you're going through all these steps and bringing all the data together, it is extremely important to keep your research. Keep the emails that you had with your supplier, the email communication, keep any research you find, keep everything. You can convert anything into a PDF, and it's really, really good when you can link that PDF to your substance itself. So if you're using a software, you can link it right to the database entry. That would be lovely because then it's saved right with all of your data. If you're not using your software and you have your data, make sure it's in the same folder, that it's not somewhere else. And in 5 years, you always have to think ahead. In 5 years, is somebody going to perhaps delete another folder on a different drive where you had your data? Is somebody going to be able to find it? What if something happens and you're not in that company? So you always have to think ahead of these types of things. So keep it together and really make it simple.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point there with the fact that as manufacturer, you have to kind of justify what it is that you are doing when it comes to classifying your own final product, right? And your own mixture. That's a great point with wanting to keep the justification, right? And so that if you ever have an inspection or some authority asks, well, how did you come to that classification? You better have a good means of retrieving the data to justify your answer. So great suggestion right there.
Exactly. And
What about,
sorry, just a quick thing to
please.
add in there.
Yeah.
A simple memo function can be useful as well. So you might link your data to your substance, but a simple memo function will make sure that future users, future people who look at the substance or looking for information or explanations for things get it. So that can be right out in the front.
Yeah. A very good filing system, right? In
And
paper or otherwise
Mhm.
makes a whole world of difference. So great.
Mhm.
And next steps here. So now that you've come to a classification, you obviously have 15 other sections of your SDS to populate, right? What
Mhm.
happens there? Any suggestions or trip ups potentially that people face when they're working with the SDS in that sense?
Well, those parts can be overwhelming again. So you have to look at it as it needs to be a consistent document. The sections do not stand alone. So you start on your classification and that trickles through in the various aspects of your SDS. And your section 3, ingredients for preparation, also trickles through into the various aspects. So while you do have to make sure there's this alignment throughout, on the other hand, you have to remember that the legislation, the requirements in Section 3 are going to be different than what substance list information is required. For example, you may have a list of substances in Section 3, but a different list of substances or a larger list of substances in Section 15 under a substance listing. So that often leads to some questions and surprises. Why are not the same substances appearing in all the places? Or hazard triggers in Section 2 for your labeling, they're not going to be exactly the same as what you have in your Section 3. So you do have to think of it as separate legislation, but you have to make sure that it does align. Now, that can become a bit problematic sometimes with transport legislation, where the classifications do not so perfectly align. And then that can be an issue in the US because the environmental hazards were not adopted by OSHA, but then you will have an environmental hazard classification in Section 14. So how do you deal with a situation like that? You do need to make sure that the environmental hazard is conveyed in that regard. And in ecotox data and things like that in your SDS, but then you would end up not having a hazard statement in Section 2. So it can be problematic, but make sure that things align and make sense. Your SDS cannot be contradictory, and it should not be full of technical terminology. I've seen SDSs, and really they're lovely because they are so full of information. With what I do, the SDSs I see often are very slim, and you really have to look for everything. But when one is just full of test data and tox data and all kinds of things, it's great because you can really work with it. But who is your audience? We're hazcom specialists, but is your audience going to understand it? So you have to make sure you make it readable. Explain what it is that you are presenting. There are going to be people reading that who don't understand what these tests are. So it doesn't help them. It simply overwhelms them. So there has to be a balance in that as well.
Good point. And as far as that, do you see? I know when the original adaptation by OSHA came out for the GHS, their adaptation of it, they wanted to make sure things like the pictogram and wording make sense to probably somebody with a average around sixth grade, comprehensibility. So that's a great point you mentioned. Certain sections are for a different audience. But I think the main thing is when you are exposed to something, you need to know right away fast without any comprehension issues, barring the way, what is the danger with this chemical? So great point there. So absolutely important to align your sections accordingly.
Yeah, and it is a natural reaction, a human reaction, that when there's too much information, it becomes overwhelming to read, especially if you're not that well versed in the topic. And so that causes problems in the long run.
Absolutely. What about, do you ever find issues where clients or users of the SDS have run into deadlines and want to, I know I get this a lot where it's multiple countries. Can I make one SDS cover all my countries?
No, please
don't. I'm sure you have a story there.
I'm sure that's the exact same way you react. No, you do not want to make an SDS for multiple countries. That just makes more work in the long run. It looks like it's easier. But when you're doing that, when you're putting together the legislation of 2 or 3 countries or so, what you're doing is you're creating your own structure. Because for each situation where things don't perfectly align, you have to make a decision. So in a way, that should be a rule-based decision to ensure that you have a consistency. So there has to be a logic behind it. It can't just be sort of willy-nilly. Then, in a few years down the road, the legislation for one of those countries changes. Now, first of all, if this person isn't there anymore to do it, there's a new person, they won't know the approach someone took. And even if they do, can be applied consistently. But then you're again trying to force an alignment and a logic that is not actually there. So that's just more work for everybody.
Right.
But then the other issue, of course, is the difference in classification. And classes and categories, it's just, I cannot understand why you would want to do something like that, because then you could overclassify, you could underclassify. Taking the worst approach is not always the best, because there are reasons. Each country has their own form of classification. So we all know that globally harmonized system is not harmonized, and countries want
global.
their law. Yeah.
Right.
And countries want their laws implemented and not someone else's on their documents.
Sure.
Yeah.
And again, you're losing that communication piece, right? Now you're confusing folks. You're going to have your export being stopped at the border. Lots of problems and headaches you don't want.
Exactly.
And now, let's say I've got my perfect SDS. I've followed your advice up to this point. And now it's now up to me to review and distribute this SDS. Any pain points you see along the way there?
So when you're reviewing, so one of the things it's about reviewed on. That's the thing. So sometimes you may review it even though nothing changed. So people are going to look for your reviewed on date, and that's more strict in Australia, for example. That it is a reviewed on date, because an older SDS is not going to make anybody happy. And so you need to show that you actually looked at it and made sure it's up to date, even if nothing changed. So it's okay if the version doesn't change, but your reviewed on date does. So that's one aspect of that. And then there are different rules on when SDSs need to be updated or sent out. Things like that. So different countries have different rules. So it's really important to create a timeline, a structured timeline at which you're going to go back and review your SDSs and make sure that they're up to date. So you are staying within legal requirements. And it doesn't hurt to do it more, but it can hurt you to do it less.
Sure.
Um, yes, yeah, sorry.
Okay. And it brings up a good point. At one time we had this Canada rule every 3 years, right, to update, and that has stuck with a lot of folks. Does this mean I always have to look? What is your advice on that?
Well, that's a thing that some people aren't aware of. While that rule doesn't exist in Canada, in federal, so in the legislation itself, individual provinces have kept it. So that goes back to the very beginning when I said you have to look at your bigger level and then go down into the smaller levels. So in that case, it's just easier to do it for all of Canada rather than have to keep track of where you do what.
Right, right. But again, they're consistently what happens in the case where a province now stops me. Is it easy to fix, do you think, in that case? Get the review done because you haven't made that 3-year deadline for that specific province. If that is it, so it is that inconsistent potentially in the country of Canada?
Well, it can be. So you're not going to be stopped between the provinces,
Okay.
but if it comes out that the SDS hasn't been updated, that is being used by people, there can be issues. So as long as you have a consistent and simple, straightforward system for making your SDSs, it's also really easy to update your SDSs. So
Okay.
yes, of course, that comes in a lot when you're looking at software, but as long as you have a straightforward approach and a step-by-step approach, it doesn't become a gigantic piece of work to get them all updated and to make sure that they're updated.
Okay. So really a good process system in place that's flagging or at least identifying these potential changes that could happen as you do these things.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And the other thing, different countries do require, well, all the countries require you to keep your old SDSs. So make sure you do keep them and keep them with your substance data, with your preparation data, so that you can refer back to them in the future. And in the support, I've used those when questions arise. Why has the classification changed? Why has this changed? And then we can look back at the old SDSs and make comparisons and actually see what happened.
Sure. Again, going back to justification for why you are making the judgments you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else that you see as far as pitfalls or common pain points that we haven't discussed to this point?
So you'll have situations. So the hazcom specialists, the ones who are making the SDSs, are not always just doing SDSs. So they have other things to do in a company as well. So that is why having a structured approach to it is really helpful, because when you have to get a document out quickly, you know exactly what steps to take and to get that out. Another issue is that sometimes the people who have comments about your SDS don't actually know much about hazcom. So then you have situations, and this I do hear common in the US. Well, my competitor doesn't have it marked as a carcinogen, but it's appearing as a carcinogen for us. Why? And then, of course, the manager doesn't like that. That looks terrible in the market. But if you look at the guidance document from OSHA, it clearly says that even though Appendix F is not mandatory, the ARIAC and NTP classification must be used unless you can justify not to. So while, yes, it looks worse on the market, what will be worse is the fines if something happens or if you get audited. So what I always recommend is show the legislation, prove it with legislation. So anybody who questions, they're not going to doubt your opinion. They can see it directly in the legislation, and there's nothing they can do. Because the problem is, it will come back to the person who asked the SDS.
Right. And then eventually, ideally, then maybe substitute that chemical out, reformulate your product, right? Don't have that issue in the first place if you can, right?
Absolutely, yes. And you see these issues too when you're comparing any USDS to the US SDS, I see these questions often as well. Why is the classification different? And there again, you want your legal references. That's all you need to prove your point.
Right. Fantastic. Great suggestions and points. So, as far as that, do you see any future trends in our profession, the hazard communication and other related fields of what we do?
Yes, so naturally there's a big move for safety in the chemicals. So the PFAS situation, we have microplastics, we have nanoforms. A lot of things are coming in that regard. As new things come in, of course, a few urban legends develop. So something might just be in discussion or a draft document, and somebody already wants it on the document, and you're not really sure what to do. So you have to be careful with those, but you have to be aware of what is happening with those. And then, of course, there's going to have to be a phasing out of certain ingredients. Like you said, you might want to replace the ingredient. So you do have to keep up to date on the market in that regard. And then another major thing that is happening, of course, is AI. And that is happening everywhere. That is affecting everyone at all times. And it can be such a useful tool, and it can be built directly into software. And of course, the capabilities of a software itself, if you're making SDS, this was one, are growing exponentially. You can make system-to-system communications with ECHA, various things like that. New abilities are coming into the program. Certain things you would, of course, want to use with caution. So AI has its certain risks, but it can be used very well. Another thing that is growing hugely in the industry is multilingual demands, registrations, and notifications. More and more countries are bringing in registration systems, and you have to be aware of what your requirements are if you're going to be transporting or shipping into those countries. And often you do need only representatives in the country or an address in the country, especially in the EU. That is a very important thing. So that is growing in many aspects of the world.
So that piece about only registrants and registrations, your representative there, does that typically mean that you need to have your own company entity available in that country, or is there another workaround? Let's say I'm only US based, but I'm emerging in my market and I want to start selling into Europe. What are my options there?
Well, if you're going to be selling into Europe, you need to do a poison center notification. And for poison center notification, you need an ECHA legal entity, and the ECHA legal entity must be an EU address. So if you don't have a sister company in the EU, you will have either an only representative that is importing your substance, or you have an importer. And one of those two will have to be the ECHA legal entity to make your PCN notifications. So you do have that connection. You can't just send it to the EU without that extra step.
Okay. And that has to be in the member country as well as other member countries as you trade out from different countries, right? Within Europe?
No. So the PCN notification has to be done for the member country, but the address needs to only be anywhere in Europe. So you don't need an address for each member country
that you're trading into, as long as there's one that's a member country.
Yeah. So I said anywhere in Europe, it should be anywhere in the EU. Because if you have an address in Switzerland, that will not help you for your PCN notifications. Okay.
Good to know. So that's very helpful. As any other future trends we're seeing, but that you can see, or I know it's the future, so who knows, right? At this point.
Yeah, what I see is that more and more people are moving to automation. Once in a while, I still see some people who do make their SDSs from scratch by themselves, but people are realizing that just isn't going to work. So they either go through consulting companies who make their SDSs for them, or they turn to one of the many softwares on the market to do it, because that helps keep up to date on the information. It becomes impossible to keep up to date on all of the substance listings and changes, the exposure limits and changes. legislative changes. Yes, the OSHA HCS stayed the same for a few years, but if we're dealing with Europe, you have a new ATP coming out all the time. And so how do you keep up with all of that? Unless it's all you do is hazcom and you're focused on doing that research. So that's where, well, when you use a software, there's usually a team of researchers who is ensuring that all of that data is updated for you. You can also sign up for databases where you can get that information, but it's not possible for one person or a few people to just know everything. So you do need
Sure.
to rely on some sort of electronic sources more and more.
Great. Great. Well, it's been a great discussion, Manuela. Thank you for covering some important topics in this field.
Mm.
What is your final takeaway for our listeners that you think would be helpful for them to know at the conclusion of this episode?
Yeah. So it's all about balance when it comes to hazcom. So you need to balance regulations and reality. So real life applications, because somebody's actually going to use that product or there's going to be an accident. So it has to be regulations and reality. You need to have a balance between compliance and clarity and automation and human expertise. So you need to balance all of these various things. You need to remember that more is not always better. So, for example, Section 3 of an SDS, you have Section 3.1 for raw materials, Section 3.2 for preparations. Now, I've seen SDSs where somebody outputs Section 3.1 not applicable, Section 3.2 with preparation information, but if you look at the legislation, you're actually supposed to only use one or the other. So while it seems not a major issue, it's more is not better in that situation because you're actually not following the legislation. So you have to be careful on things like that as well. So it's all about balance and hazcom.
All right. Well, thank you for that. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. For more about Manuela, please visit the hackyourhazcom.com website. Her bio and other contact information is there. And we'd love to have you on as a future guest. Thank you again. We appreciate everything you do for our industry. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.